for life.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum to our viewers and listeners. Today we have a very special guest with us, a very important conversation with philosopher Carlos Sanchez, who's a professor at San Jose State University. His most recent published book, A Sense of Brutality, Philosophy and Narco Culture. We're going to be talking about this particular text. Carlos Sanchez published about 8 books, and some of those books are, for example, his most now another book is actually in the press, which is Emilio Uranga's analysis of Mexican being, and then there's Sense of Brutality, the disintegration of community, Mexican philosophy in the 20th century, essential readings, contingency and commitment, the suspension of seriousness, and a few other texts. He has about 30 articles that are published, and Carlos is someone who focuses his work on Mexican philosophy, phenomenology, as well as more generally, broadly speaking, political philosophy. And he's trained in the continental tradition, and he offers courses on Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, and he's an expert in Husserl studies. So, Carlos, welcome to our show, and thanks for coming
Thank you.
through.
Thank you for having me.
So,
Looking forward to it.
so this text, A Sense of Brutality, before we go into the actual text, I mean, we want to sort of be technical in our conversation, philosophically technical, but I want to first ask about the writing process because you're dealing with a very difficult subject, the subject of narco culture. And I wanted to see there is a sort of like a misunderstanding perhaps, but sometimes it's correct that philosophers tend to write from from the Eiffel Tower, like they're at their desks, they're not really engaged with in the society that they're writing about, they're dealing with moral and ethical issues and so on. In this particular instance, it seems like there would have to be a much more direct kind of encounter in a way with the topic and the subject matter. So I would like to hear from you a little bit about that writing process and sort of embodied sense of writing and a kind of embeddedness in the culture. Would you like to share with us how you approach this text?
Yeah, sure. One of my earliest memories as growing up in here in California was as a young kid. I was about maybe 16 years old, and I had a favorite uncle, and this uncle used to pass by my house every month. He lived up there in Stockton, and I lived down there in Monterey County. And he would stop by every month, and he would always be driving a different car. He had always had a different car, right? And they were not new cars, but they were different cars. And then I would ask him like, why do you have a different car? And he would say, oh, because I take him down to Mexico and I sell them, right? I take the car down to Mexico and I sell it. And I thought, okay, well, that's an interesting business. All right. So he takes used cars from the United States, takes them to Mexico and sells them, comes back, gets another one, takes it back. And he was a great guy. And I really loved him. And he paid attention to me, and he was interested in what I did. About maybe a year into his selling cars business, he turns up dead in a small town in Michoacan, in the southwestern part of Mexico, called Uruapan, and they found him riddled with bullets and naked in a garbage dump. And it was very shocking to me, like how did that happen? And it turns out after some initial investigation that he was not really taking cars down to the border and selling them. He was taking money down to the border and transferring it to someone else and using the cover of selling cars, right? That always stuck with me. That always stuck with me. This idea that my uncle was so brutally murdered, and nobody really did anything about it. It was just kind of forgotten. And so recently, before I started writing this book, I had this this sense of concern about what was going on in Mexico. That there was all these news and reports about disappearances, decapitations, live, stream decapitations and executions taking place in Mexico.
Mm.
And we weren't really talking about them, right? The United States, here in the States, no one was talking about them. And that was concerning me. It was concerning me as a person, but also as a thinker that prides himself on thinking about issues of human concern, right?
Mhm.
I thought, well, how come nobody's being humanly concerned with these things, and so I started thinking more about it and thinking about the violence that is happening there. And I got into the literature. I got into there's not a lot of literature in this.
Yeah.
What you have in terms of narco culture and the narco lifestyle and narco violence, what you have is a lot of reports that are written by Americans about the violence in Mexico, right? And then you have reports written by the Mexican government
Mm.
about the criminal underground, right?
Right.
And then you have these blogs that just kind of repeat the images,
Right.
and so you get there's a sense that it's all spectacularized, right? It's all turned into this spectacle. So I wanted to get more philosophical about it. Like, okay, well, I want
Yeah.
to think more about what exactly is going on and why.
Right. Right.
And so one of the things that I decided to do is that I started reaching out to the contacts that I have made over the years in Mexico, doing this the history of Mexican philosophy, and just reaching out to folks. And it turns out that I was able to connect with the faculty of philosophy at the Autonomous University in Sinaloa,
Mm.
in Culiacan, which Culiacan city is the hub of narco culture, right? That's where it all begins. And so I was able to go there a few times and speak to a lot of folks that are involved in this, and to speak to and to be and to experience it too, right? To experience the actual culture at work. Um, and I wanted to do that not only to like get my own sense as to what was going on, but also um, to be to have a genuine thought about it, right? To have a
Mm.
situated, genuine thought about what was happening, and to think of it from that perspective, and not from a U.S. academic thinking about something that's going down out there and reading the reports.
Mhm.
I wanted to like actually be involved in that, and I was lucky, right? Lucky enough to experience a few moments where it really clarified to me the difference uh,
Mhm.
that I speak about in the book.
Yeah, I mean that's well. First of all, that's very courageous of you. I mean, obviously, it's a very risky and dangerous terrain um, to do this. And it's interesting at the level of methodology or writing process when you're thinking about this encounter. It seems like even though you're a philosopher and the text is very philosophical and phenomenological when I read it, um, the approach was kind of ethnographic to an extent without being sort of a vulgar positivist and just doing reports, but this kind of embodied way of thinking about it and kind of traveling there and coming back and exploring it as a real subject matter. It was really a different kind of read for me than conventional phenomenology texts. Nothing wrong with those, but there was something about this work that was very concrete. Um, so, but would you like to? Before I go there, I actually want to inform, and talk to our viewers that the reason why this is important for us, because we're working with the Islamic world and kind of dealing with topics that are relevant for us. Narco culture is a global culture as well. I mean, you dealt with the specific case study of Mexico, the political transactions, the political economic structure of the narco circuits, all of that deeply influences the Islamic world. Islamic studies tends to focus mainly on the moral dimensions of Islam and not necessarily the immediate life problems of death and violence and injury that we're dealing with in that part of the world. But there is a tremendous interest to understand this. right? For example, if you look at South and Central Asia, the youth in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, there's like a very high rate of addiction to opium. So there is also a very serious reemergence of what is called enforced disappearance, which is normally done under the war on terror logic through counterterrorism forces, which are not just the cops, but a different kind of apparatus that disappears bodies. In Bangladesh, this is a very extreme form of violence that has become sort of common now. And there are rumors about body parts being discovered later, graves being discovered, bodies floating all of a sudden in water, and so on. We have many people who are disappeared, and some of the my interlocutors who I've worked with as an ethnographer has been missing for a long time. So there's this whole question about numbering and not being able to locate and things like that. Erasure. All of these things have phenomenological consequences as well when we're thinking about them. But having said that, I wanted to ask you about the methodology. Even though you were embedded, even though you did go and actually study, you did apply a very technical kind of way of looking at brutality, and that to me was very clear. And I want to, because it was not journalism, it was not reports, it was not, right, it was not just like, hey, this is horrible human rights violations are happening in Mexico. It was not, none of that. It was actual, direct, a sincere phenomenological exploration. So would you talk to us a little bit about that, this notion of your field of phenomenology and how that's actually been useful for this project?
Yeah, well, I was trained in Husserlian phenomenology, which is a very rigorous and technical
Yeah.
approach to existence, right? Um, and it's supposed to be, at the end of the day, something where the results are very detached and very abstract, universalizable, and all of that.
Yeah.
That's how I was trained. But my training in phenomenology also includes the work of the Mexican phenomenologists and their predecessors, who were basically Ortega y Gasset, and his students in Spain, right? Who, after the Franco takeover in '38, left to teach in Mexico City. And their approach to phenomenology is one where they are not afraid to use the methods of phenomenology for things that would otherwise not make it into the registers, right? For instance, it's a very specific situated form of life, which is Mexican, would never make it into a phenomenological study about life,
Right.
by
Right.
any other phenomenologist. So this very situated and concrete look at things comes from that school of Ortega y Gasset. And the Mexicans in the 1940s and 50s realized that no one was really thinking about the difference that existed historically and culturally between themselves and the rest of the world as a former colonized peoples who now have to reckon with the inheritances of that colonization. How do they look at themselves, particularly their differences and their struggles? And so they adapted phenomenology to be able to look at specific problems, and unashamedly so, right?
Right.
And so that's what I decided that, I mean, I've been doing this for a while, but I realized that this was the only way to approach this problem that I had an issue with, by situating it and looking at it phenomenologically, but at the same time, not not being concerned with whether or not it was going to appease the gods of phenomenology, right?
Right.
Whether or
Right.
not it was going to appease the rigorous requirements,
Yeah.
because I think that it's important in an urgent case, right? And I'll tell you this: one of the things when I talk about brutality as a concept that needs to be considered, and I go through the phenomenological steps to kind of look at it. Um, one of the reasons why I did that is also because I wanted to show um, that ultimately what we have is is a is a phenomenon, this phenomenon of this kind of violence where, you know, you were talking about disappearances and
Yeah.
all things, and then there's a mixture between or there's a blurriness in what the government is and what the criminal element is, and you don't know who's who, you know. And
Yeah.
but they've deployed and they developed and deployed this practice
Hmm.
that I call brutality in the book, where violence becomes so pervasive and so brutal
Hmm.
uh, that it leaves you speechless, right? And
Hmm.
by leaving you speechless, you don't talk about it, and nobody talks about it, and then you kind of just pass it over.
Yeah.
And so I wanted, I knew that I needed this situated, concrete phenomenological analysis in order to pick that out. I
Hmm.
wasn't going to get it by doing a standard phenomenological
Right. Right.
approach to it. I was going to end up with violence,
Yeah.
and I didn't want to end up with violence. You know, I wanted to end up with what was really be like what I was really seeing, which was not
Hmm.
violence. So so
That's key.
that's a little bit of that method. Yeah.
I mean, I do want to discuss this difference you have in this text, which is so useful. It's going to obviously help my work now.
Yeah.
I have to have a conversation with Carlos Sanchez now. I have to cite you. I have to talk about the stuff. Um, but I do want to talk about that difference between terror, violence, and brutality versus cruelty, etc. But before we go there, I want to read a very short excerpt from your text, and
Mm.
I basically want you to talk about that excerpt a little bit, if it's possible. So
Okay.
I'm going to read this part um, right now. It's about modernity and the incongruity of death. So this part. Um, so here, this is from your book. In telling you how I die, I tell you who I am. I am the way of my death. This means that my death will reflect my life, or simply that I should die as I lived. If my death is tragic, then my life was tragic. If my death is quiet, then my life was quiet. If my death is violent, then so was my life. In a telling passage, Octavio Paz writes, death, like life, is not transferable. If we do not die as we lived, it is because the life we lived was not really ours. It did not belong to us, just as the bad death that kills us does not belong to us. End quote. An incongruity between life and death, whereby one's death does not reflect one's life, can only mean, according to Paz, that somewhere along the line, one's life was somehow replaced with someone else's life. If I don't die as I lived, then I died someone else's death. This can only mean that I lived a false life, a life in bad faith, an imposed life, or a stolen life. If I die a tragic death while having lived a peaceful life, then the peaceful life I lived was false. It didn't belong to me. Likewise, if I lived a violent life but die a peaceful death, then the violent life I lived did not belong to me. It was imposed. It was false. Who or what imposes a life that can only lead to a bad death, a wrong death, one that did not belong to me in the first place? If this is the modern conception of death, then we can only guess that modernity itself makes possible these incongruities, end quote. So that's the passage. It is so in depth in terms of its exploration, but at the same time, it is so immediate in a way where death is not an abstraction. There's a concreteness in here. Just talk to us a little bit about this passage and why you thought about it this way.
Well, the reason why that I wrote that, and I mean the whole book is basically, you know, summarized very well there from a very abstract angle, um, because I wanted to make sure, and I've had very deep philosophical discussions with people who don't agree with me on this point, but you
Yeah, sure.
know, I want to say that,
I kind of agree. I just
yeah,
want to make that clear because from my field work, I kind of agree with this. But I can totally understand why some people would be like, this is too direct. And even this, the way you move there, technically, at the level of phenomenology, is very, um, I don't know the exact word, but it's very direct and concrete and sincere about the objective violence that becomes the body that has to be dismembered. And
mhm,
in that sense, it seems really honest in its philosophical exploration. And I think a lot of folks with maybe liberal sensibility will have problems with this because they don't want to think about the monstrosity of modernity. They want to think of it as reason, as enlightenment, as reformation, as the possibility of humanness, etc. So, the way you kind of do this reversal in a way, which seems really important to understand the contradictions of life. But anyway, I don't want to interrupt. Go ahead. Sorry.
no, no, you hit it right on the head, and also one of the things that I think modernity tricks us into thinking is that we have free will, right?
Yeah.
And so at that point in that passage that you read, one of the things that I was trying to make clear is that people that live in these contexts of violence, in these situations of narco culture, um, didn't really pick that for themselves, right? They
Hmm.
didn't decide one day,
Right.
this is the best life for me. They didn't have an option.
Right.
This is the best of two worst choices. Either I die in poverty, or I do this, right?
Hmm.
And so I think that one of the things that I try to make clear in the book when I talk about brutality as this, I say something about brutality as an ontological kind of phenomenon,
I was going to ask that.
because I want to say that this those people that are carrying out brutal acts uh, are carrying them out on the orders of, right, to put it in these words,
Hmm.
not their own conscience, right?
Right.
They're doing this because they are in a situation in which they must do this. It is demanded by their context and their
Hmm.
particular moment that they do these things. And so that's why the thought of dying a false death uh, um, really kind of captured me, because there's a lot of people in these contexts, but
Hmm.
also in other contexts where brutality is rampant,
Yeah.
um, where they are not dying the deaths that they were meant to die in a certain sense, to put it this way. uh, they're dying deaths that have been imposed upon them by a circumstance
Hmm.
created by perhaps neoliberal economic tendencies,
Hmm.
and they don't necessarily get to choose that death, right?
Yeah.
So it's inauthentic in that sense.
Yeah.
um, and I think it's happening quite a bit, in Mexico and in other places where narco culture has become the primary economic system.
Right.
Um, and I'm gonna guess that it happens also where just brutality has found a foothold. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned a little bit about political economy, even though the text obviously is focused so much on something much more elemental at the level
Hmm.
of being. I mean, this is why ontology becomes such an important category for these conversations. Um, yeah, I mean, that's really not just interesting. It actually forces you to think differently, and I think that's something that I remember actually early on when you first came into as a professor at San Jose State. I remember you had told me, and I hope it's okay to share,
Hmm.
that I went to and this is me rephrasing completely, so I take all the blame if it's wrong. This is my wording. I, is it Tanzania? I went to the class and I said I did not do cultural studies when it came to Mexico, and I started to talk to people quite directly that we have stopped thinking. And you said that there was a reaction from a lot of the students. One of the things that I really liked during those conversations with you, which continue to this day, is this technical dimension of what is thinking. You don't Thinking is not just this empirical thing that happens in the brain and a bunch of processes of biochemistry, etc. It's actually a very specific act. You can think about different acts, like people do, like rituals of prayer. Prayer is not just you say some words, right? It has to have a system. And we know that from any philosopher, that thinking, and they debate on how that works, but there is a technicality to it. And I really find your work to be very serious about this, that you don't simply do sort of cultural studies, you actually do philosophical studies on matters that are significant in terms of culture.
Mm.
And so in this text, you don't do a definition of culture that is sort of a cultural studies orientation. You sort of do a philosophical definition of culture, and particularly narco culture. So I would like for you to kind of talk about this within the structure of your book. So this is the part that I want to say.
Mm.
So your book has a very specific structure, which was also for me striking. And it had a phenomenological style. It starts sort of with culture, then it talks about narco culture. It talks about violence, then it talks about brutality, right? And then it goes to personhood. There is a reason why you're mapping this phenomena in this way. And if you don't mind talking about culture and why this mapping, this shape of the book in terms of your approach.
Yeah, well, culture to me is all those things um, that surround me, right? It is a circumstance in which I find myself, and I found that when I was starting to think about narco culture, and I would bring it up to people. I would just and as a matter of fact, in a few uh, symposia that I went to in Culiacan in Sinaloa, someone in the audience would always say something, not to me, but to someone else. They would say something like, well, narco culture is just, it's not a real thing. Like it's not, it's a subculture at best, right?
Right. You argue
Um,
against subculture. You
yeah,
think of
yeah,
culture as a form of life.
yeah, that's right. And so I couldn't agree with that,
Right.
because I felt that anybody that is going through the trials and tribulations of the narco way of life is necessarily in that culture, right?
Hmm.
And it is a real culture. It's a real thing for them.
Yeah.
And so I started to really think about the notion of culture itself and what it is, and how much we fetishize it as something that actually exists, right? And so to say that narco culture is a subculture, to me meant that there was a culture of which that was a subfield, right?
Right.
Of which that was a subculture, and this monolithic culture,
Hmm.
held the cards, and it held the rules of the game, and I couldn't agree with that.
Right.
So I had to come to the understanding with myself that there's no one monolithic culture. There's many cultures, and they're all cultures in their own way. And then I had to move from that and define it as a way of life, right?
Yeah.
A culture is a way of life. It's something um, that has its own rules, and it has its own ways of proceeding. It has its own rituals, and its own economies at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
And so all these cultures are valid, and narco culture itself, with its own rules and its own
Right.
habits, is going to dictate who lives and who dies, and how they live and how they die. And that's why I wanted to set that first. I wanted to set that up first, right? Because
Hmm.
then you have the context, and then you can move on to the different things that happen in that context,
Yeah.
culminating into what happens to people, right? At the end of
Right.
the day, or what could happen to someone in that
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that was really for me a very sort of, I learned from it. I learned from even the structure of the book, really, how to approach a problem. Um, I want to actually focus a little bit on the way you deal with the question of violence, and
Mhm.
you have your to put it mildly, you think violence as a category has its significant limits in understanding narco culture, and therefore one has to go towards brutality and understanding brutality without relying on, and this is my word, sort of liberal understanding of cruelty. Oh, this is, sort of moralism that goes with
Mhm.
condemnation. So instead of doing that, you go to brutality, and you kind of you have this encounter, and you say, well, these are some of the conversations about violence that's happening with Fanon and Hannah Arendt, and some of the questions that Jean-Paul Sartre asks about what violence is. And this is what I think. And you sort of explore that. You also engage Slavoj Žižek, his tripartite kind of definition of violence, and you focus on the third one instead of the symbolic and the other one. You sort of focus on the objective violence question, and you kind of
Mhm.
connect that to brutality, which I thought was a fascinating kind of journey in understanding philosophically how you arrived at brutality. It's not a simple brutality does not become for you like an adjective. It's
Mhm.
not like, how people use police brutality, such and
Mhm.
such brutality. So brutality is simply a word that basically heightens the meaning of the police, but it doesn't say anything about brutality itself,
Mhm.
right? So your book, even though it does talk about narco culture, it does explore brutality itself within the cultural landscape that you've encountered. And
Mhm.
so I would like for you to sort of tell us a little bit about the question of violence, and you for example, and this is a quotation from you, which is, you say that violence is internal to the permanent field of being, while brutality is an emergence, something more than violence.
Mhm.
If you could talk to us about this.
Yeah, well, one that's a key linchpin of the book. This distinction between violence and brutality. I wanted to make sure that uh, that was clear for me, and I think that violence in the phenomenological, studies that I've done and I've encountered and read about. Whenever phenomenologists are talking about violence, violence can be anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
Violence can be anything from kissing somebody
Mm-hmm.
to murdering someone, and what that
But
does,
in Derrida's case, speaking.
yeah, speaking, right? Or the with a poet, you're going
Yeah,
through a rose bush and you destroy a flower, and that's a violent
yeah,
act.
yeah.
For Levinas, you have the violence of emerging from the being that is to a particular existence, right? So I mean,
Yeah.
so violence to me in that tradition was um, was just being generalized to the
Yeah.
point that it became insignificant as a concept, right?
Right.
It became
Right.
useless,
Right.
and then you have people like Sartre, misreading
Mm.
Fanon and
Yeah.
talking about how violence constitutes being, and in this weird way
Mm-hmm.
where he thinks that violence is going to create who you are.
The human reconstruction you
Yeah, to
talked about.
reconstruct you in some weird sense that he doesn't really explain. And to me, all these readings of violence just turn it into a useless concept. You can't really apply it anywhere. It doesn't really
Right.
say much.
Right.
If you say, there's so much violence going on in
Right.
Venezuela right now, well, okay, so whatever, right?
Right.
But and so I wanted to make sure that I looked at it carefully and see, okay, why is it that this is if we say that there's narco culture is a culture of violence, like what exactly am I saying?
Right.
Well, I wasn't really saying much. What I wanted to say was, if you look at the violence itself, at the concrete violence, you will see that none of these concepts or none of these variations of the concept of violence that I've seen
Yeah.
capture that, right? The
Right.
concreteness of dismembering a human being, of killing somebody in the middle of the street,
Mm-hmm.
of just torture and injury that's beyond words, right?
Mm-hmm.
If violence doesn't capture that, and so I wanted to say, okay, so what does capture it? Well, for me, luckily for me, there was a distinction made by Max Scheler, right, the
Mm.
German
Yeah.
phenomenologist, and the distinction that he makes between cruelty and brutality takes up no more than 3 or 4 sentences
Mm.
in a book from 1911,
Hmm.
and he just kind of says it and moves right along, right?
So
But
you
then
had
when
to meditate. You had to meditate on that.
I came across it and I was like, wait a minute. And so I kind of stopped by it and I looked at it and I went back and I diagrammed it and I dissected it and I thought
Right.
about it and I thought, yes, this is right. There is a
Hmm.
this a distinction hits on something that we need to say more about, right?
Yeah.
Um, and basically what he does is that he says that brutality um, and cruelty are forms of violence, but they are, like I say in the book, they emerge from the context of being, right? It's
Hmm.
you don't find them naturally there.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, and so what is and so then he gives us definitions, right? Brutality. He says if you kick a log of wood,
Hmm.
uh, you are not being brutal towards it,
Hmm.
right? And when he said that, I immediately thought about what you do to a human body in the context of narco culture and the context of these other brutal contexts, right? Where you can dismember a human body,
Hmm.
but nobody gives a second thought to it. Why? Well, because it's not a human body anymore. It's a log of wood, right? You've turned it
Hmm.
into a log of wood. You turn it into an object.
Objectification.
A complete objectification, complete
Hmm.
dehumanization
Hmm.
of this other, right?
Hmm.
And so I thought that that concept better captured that what I was seeing in narco culture than any other concept.
Hmm.
Cruelty, on the other hand, has this um, has a connotation of being the cruelty of someone, right? You have the person is cruel. You take joy and pleasure in the suffering of another person, and
Yeah.
so there's an effective quality to cruelty that I didn't think this brutality that was being captured by what I was seeing, right? Or that
Right.
what I was being seen within wasn't reflecting that. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, it's certainly the case that a lot of these people that commit these brutal acts are cruel. Absolutely, there's these guys that truly enjoy the
Hmm.
murder that they bring about. But for the most part,
Hmm.
it didn't seem to me that the people carrying out these horrendous acts
Hmm.
were being cruel. They were being brutal.
Right.
They weren't being cruel. It was
So what's the technical difference for our viewers?
the technical difference is that in brutality, the joy and pleasure that you take in killing someone is absent.
Mm.
While in cruelty, you take pleasure and you get joy from seeing another person
Mm.
suffer. So a brutal person, according to Shaler, the way Shaler says, is a brutal
Yeah.
person is not going to take joy in decapitating another.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but he's not going to take joy in that simply because by the time he actually performs the act, the other person is not a person; it's an object.
Yeah.
And
Also
then
seems like a technical operation
yeah,
with some
absolutely.
skills necessary. So he's performing like a professional in a way.
Yes, a professional whose rules of and a professional who finds
Hmm.
his Craigslist professional ad in
Right.
the context of that culture, right?
That's right. That's
So
right.
it's
I
important. I
get it.
think it's an important distinction, and so I go on and I talk about what I call the logic of brutality,
Yeah.
where I try to show how brutality actually hides itself, right? How
Yeah.
and these cultures of where brutality is rampant, uh, you won't necessarily see it, right?
Yeah.
It will become something that happens, and there's this great picture that I was going to put at the cover of the book
Hmm.
that I eventually didn't get to do because it was too expensive. But
Hmm.
Reuters trying to sell it to me for like $3,000 or something. But
Wow.
yeah, it was a picture that a photographer took in Mexico, in one of these in the state of Guerrero, which is a
Hmm.
hotbed of narco activity. Um, and in the Guerrero, by the way, means warrior,
Mm.
but in the state of Guerrero, and there's a picture of a guy selling, you know, the corn with the butter and the chili sauce
Yeah.
that you see guys selling on the street.
Yeah.
And there was a guy. It was a picture of this guy selling his corn to
Mm.
people, and there was a crowd of people kind of surrounding him, um, buying this corn, and he was handing corn over, and he's extending his hand with his corn to another person who's reaching over to get it, and then you look down and there's a dead body in between them, right?
Mm.
Somebody got shot, but the business of buying the corn could not stop, right?
Right.
And also there's no horror,
Mm.
there's no disgust, right? It's like,
Right.
okay, so this happened, let's continue on, right?
So it becomes part of a form of life.
Yes, it
And this
becomes a
is where,
routine.
so a
It
mode
becomes a
of
routine,
being
yeah.
in a way also.
Yes, absolutely.
Here's something I have a question that's related to specific couple of passages. The idea of narco culture as ontology. There's a paragraph on that which I'm not going to read directly right now, but there's another passage which I want to read, and I
Mhm.
want to actually for you to tell me how do you kind of consolidate those two paragraphs.
Okay.
So you in later part in the book talk about narco ontology in a way, the ontology of being and how this is part of the ontology of being Mexican, etc.,
Mhm.
modern Mexican, and so on, contemporary. And then you have this passage, which you say, which I think is an important passage. I'm not saying that Mexicans are brutal. Rather, I maintain that the cultural topography of narco culture is brutal, that its geography is brutal, that its rites and rituals are brutal, and that the logic of brutality predominates its intersubjective negotiations, its economy, and its arts. That is, in general, that the ontology of narco culture um, is an ontology of brutality. And then there's stuff in a bracket, and you say the kinds and types of beings and events that define it. So if you could connect these two things, how you're not on one hand saying that Mexicans are brutal, but then you're saying there's this topography of brutality and there's this ontology of brutality. I particularly want you to clarify this because in cultural studies, as soon as you mention, or in anthropology actually, as soon as you mention sort of ontology and you kind of, for me, I experienced this. I mention ontology and people think that I'm essentializing Muslims or something like this when I'm actually talking about mode of life, mode of being, forms, etc. So if you could, there's a typical misunderstanding. It's actually Edward Said's fault, but that's okay. So if you could explain that, that would be great.
Yeah, well, that's right. I think that I go through to some lengths in the first chapter, I think, and to talk about the narco culture as a way of life. And I wanted to do that because eventually I wanted to get to this point where I talked about the ontology of brutality and the ontology of narco culture.
Mhm.
And basically, all I mean by that is that there is a manner of existence that it belongs to that particular culture
Mhm.
and that particular form of life. It is a manner of existence in the sense that it is there's no other way to live that culture
Mhm.
besides that way, right? If you don't live that culture in the particular way in which it is lived, then you're not living in that culture.
Mhm.
Um,
There is a
the
temporality element in there then. Also.
there is, yeah, there's
Mhm.
a temporality, of course, and it's a historical temporality
Right.
that goes along with that. And so the ontology of narco culture is going to be constituted by these other ways of being that involve artistic ways of being, religious ways of being, economic ways of being, and all of these things. And
Mhm.
together they will make up the ontology of narco culture. And then brutality, the ontology of brutality, um, or when brutality becomes ontologized, is when, to me at least, it just means that it has firmly established itself into that culture, right? It's become
Yeah.
um, part of that culture, and that's also historicized. That's also
Yeah.
historicized, and it's also temporalized, to
Right.
that culture. So yeah, I understand ontology in the same way that you understand it. I think that
Okay.
it's just a way of life, and there's no essentialism to it, because
Right.
um, at any moment, like it's happening, like it's happening right now, and or like it's happened before, and
Mm-hmm.
with narco culture, that it
It
changes the way
shifts,
it is. It
constantly
shifts
shifts.
and it changes. One of the interesting historical things or political things that has been happening with narco culture in Mexico, for example,
Mm-hmm.
is that it began as an outlaw activity, right? It
Right.
began as an outlaw way of being, led by people like El Chapo Guzman and
Yeah.
Mario Zambada. Um, but now, recently, the head of the armed forces of Mexico
Mm-hmm.
was discovered to be a godfather of the
Right.
cartel, right? So, so narco culture is no longer so outlawed that it's against the political establishment,
Right.
right?
Right.
Now it's something that you can't differentiate what's what.
Right.
Right? So yeah, there's a temporality to it where it's necessarily the ontological configuration is going to change, and I think that that's perfectly okay.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. I mean, it became sort of part of the fiber of the society without being permanently so necessarily, essentially speaking,
Yeah,
because it has this temporal structure. So any moment there could be breakthroughs, there could be shifts, but then at the same time, there is this dominant experience that's there of
absolutely,
it's not so underground that it doesn't really touch people at the level of generality in a way.
absolutely.
I'm going to, I know we have a little bit more time, so I'm going to press a little bit.
Yeah,
It's just two more passages and then kind of discussing those things. There is a particular passage about a specific place, Jardines. And
hmm
I want to read that passage, and I want you to tell me about this location where all these graves, but there are like monuments that are there, houses and things like that, where the narco uh, leaders and so on, who were part of that culture, when they die, they create these monuments of death, and then what happens there, and you
hmm
sort of explore death in those places. So I want to read this one for our viewers. Okay, so here's your passage. Jardines is a revered and almost holy place to the people of Sinaloa. Is that good
yeah, Sinaloa.
pronunciation? Okay.
Yeah.
In order to secure my visit as a foreigner, my host had to get special permission, and not from any government designee. I'm not sure who he called or what kind of permission we received, but after a 10-minute conversation, I was allowed to freely roam the grounds. This is a place that preserves the memory of cultural heroes, so the utmost respect is demanded before one enters and while one is there. There is a complete absence of graffiti on the walls. There is no garbage on the ground. There are a few dead or wilted flowers here and there that are sure to be replaced at any moment, and there are no wandering tourists snapping selfies. One goes quietly and reverently, as if not wanting to disturb the inhabitants. In the in the dead quiet of the place, there are unannounced expectations about how to behave and how to revere, expectations that are alive, loud, and authoritative. There is a heavy threat of violence that descends with the warm, humid air. Disrespect is simply not allowed. During my visit, I understood I was merely a guest whose presence was tolerated insofar as I obeyed the rules, attended to my steps, and did not disparage the holy ground. Calling Hardenes a cemetery, however, does not do it justice. This is not truly a necropolis. This is a living community whose avenues and homes are possessed by reason and intention. The place itself aims to be a living representation of the ideal narco community. Consider its architecture. The style varies from house to house, depending, I suppose, on the preferences of the narco, who, while he lived, ordered its construction. A house in the Baroque style sits authoritatively next to a colorful two-story modernist style building, while behind it, a postmodern three-story tower with see-through window panes reaches for the sky. I have seen these streets and these houses before in the more luxurious areas of San Francisco, or the Hollywood Hills, but no one lives here. Sorry. These homes, furnished with sofas, televisions, air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and even playgrounds, are the homes of the dead, who in death fulfill some implicit cultural purpose. So, talk to us, Carlos, about this passage, about this cultural purpose of these homes of the dead and this jardines, the area, uh, philosophically.
Yeah, it's I think to me that's one of the most amazing places to be if you want to get a sense as to what narco culture is about, right? Because um, it's a weird place, man. Instead of grave stones, you
Yeah,
have monuments, houses,
right.
that
I saw a
that were,
video of it and
yeah,
just before this and trying to understand the kind of texture of that place. But go ahead.
yeah, and so and so if you look at it online, you can see the extravagance, right? Now the reason why they're constructed, uh, it's going to be the specific narcos is going to take them to their grave, but we can surmise that the reason is because there is a certain understanding of within the culture itself of what is expected uh, from you as a member of that culture. And what is expected is that you give your life to this project,
Mm,
or at least that you are willing to give your life to this project. So life itself is seen as very fragile
mhm,
and contingent, right?
mhm.
Uh, and uh, and there's a saying that I put in the book, and I've heard it since I was a kid. It's better to live as a what is it? Better to live like a king for 5 years than as a sucker for
Mhm.
the rest of my life. And it's something that really kind of it's it's really lived out by these individuals that practice and participate in the narco way of life. And what it is basically is this idea that uh, we're going to go hard, we're going to go fast, and we're going to make as much money as possible. And
Mhm.
and the money that we make is going to be a reflection of the success that we had. So that, but how is this going to be remembered? Well, I'm going to build for myself a tomb that's going to reflect that success, right?
Mhm.
And it's going to be a tomb that forevermore will show that I was feared and respected, and that I succeeded and I was good at what I was doing.
Mhm.
So there's a weird sense of triumph
Yeah.
in these different these different tombs, where you can really tell that the person who built it or who instructed its construction believed that they had succeeded in
Yeah.
what they set out to do, but they also knew that they would die soon. They knew this, and their triumph is reflected in these houses and in the luxury that they show, right? Because they also want to show that this struggle was not for nothing, right? They eventually, at the end of the day, they will be rewarded with peace and comfort, right?
Mhm.
um, and it's all inscribed, I think, in the rules of the narco game, right? It's all inscribed in the ontological instructions of
Mhm. Mhm.
this way of life, in the sense that uh, nothing is guaranteed. Things are going to be taken from you, and so if that's the case, then you better leave something behind.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is their attempt to leave something behind. And the weirdest part about the cemetery to me was
Right.
the fact that each one of these luxury condominium tombs had
Mhm.
internet, right?
Wow.
And it's like, why do you want internet
Wow.
in this place, right? Why do you want sofas and everything in there? Well, it's more
Heating,
than
air conditioning, you were saying.
heating, air conditioning, yeah, running water, some of them. So why do you want all these luxuries? And the response that I got from the folks there was, well, you need these luxuries for the Day of the Dead, right? When we celebrate on November,
Mm.
in November, the Day of the Dead, we families come and gather over the tomb, and that way they can be comfortable. But I think it's more than that, right? I think
It
it
has
has
to
to
be.
do, yeah, it has to do more with this idea of legacy,
Yeah.
the idea that um, that this was not for nothing, that I did something and I risked my life and I gave my life for this ultimate show of my success,
Mm.
and I lived like a king for 5 years, and that was okay. And this is what I had to show for it, and continue to pay the internet fee because I earned it.
Right.
And so I think that that's it tells that particular cemetery tells a lot about that cultural context.
Yeah.
And is not it goes along with other practices of burial in Mexico, where if you go to the poorest towns, you'll see very beautiful cemeteries with very
Hmm.
beautiful tombs, not at that level of extravagance though.
Hmm.
And I think that
Right.
point there, the extravagance point, is what really sets narco culture apart. That this is a culture of extremes, right? It is
Right.
the culture of extremes, and this is the culmination of that.
Yeah. And it seems bigger than a spectacle, leaving behind a spectacle. It seems like just how you defined culture or narco culture as a form of life. It seems like almost immediately people become part of this kind of transaction and this community. There's also it's a being towards death in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
You already know ahead of time the different things that are going to happen, and that you better have this kind of tomb ready, because that's where what's going to be the legacy left behind, and it would have a role to play in the world you leave behind as well. um,
Absolutely. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, that was really very strange to read, actually, and very different. It's a new phenomenon that I haven't
And
encountered. So.
it's connected. It's you touched on something there. It's connected to this because I really like to think of narco culture and these cultures of where brutality has kind of ensconced itself. I like to think of these different cultures as having the written unspoken rules about themselves.
Hmm.
Where brutality plays a key fundamental role, where violence plays a role, where cruelty plays a role, um, and all of these have their own rituals and their own ways of existing with death, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
not necessarily existing towards death, but with it. Like death
Hmm.
is part of this culture already. You know this.
Right.
And so one of the most another interesting part that I didn't really get to go into that much is the deities that they
Hmm.
worship, right?
Yeah.
A lot of these people in these states are Catholics,
Mm.
but
Mm.
it's a very strange Catholicism,
Right.
filled and mixed in with traditional indigenous rituals that go back
Mm.
centuries and thousands of years. And one of the patron saint of the Narcos is this figure of the Virgin Mary, uh,
Mm.
skeletalized, right? She's turned into
Wow.
a skeleton, and she's holding a sickle, right?
Mm.
And she's known as a Santa Muerte, or Saint Death, right?
Mm. Mm.
And you'll see a lot of houses that have this saint in the
Yeah.
front of their houses, right? And people
Right.
pray to this saint. And the Catholic Church a long time condemned
Hmm.
the use of this saint by Catholics, but they don't care in Mexico. They
Mm.
really believe that this is their saint, especially in narco
Mm.
culture. They believe that this is their saint, um, and it's a death. It's an image of death, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so it's a living with death more than a living towards it that really kind
Okay.
of captures this.
That's an interesting, yeah, that's an interesting shift. Yeah.
Yeah.
Towards that is very Heideggerian in a way, being
Yeah, and also very kind of very strictly kind of capitalistic, right? It's
yeah,
you're
yeah.
always thinking ahead, and
Right.
it's not a thinking ahead. It's more like a thinking of right now, like any
Like
moment,
being entangled in it.
being entangled. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Or um okay, so we're almost towards the end. I wanna read one more thing, and if you have something to say about this, so people sort of understand your project,
Mhm.
and we could go from there. Um, so here's another passage I'm going to read actually. One might wonder why I insist on saying that narco culture must be interrogated as a characteristically violent culture. I could, for example, focus on its contributions to literature, narco literature, fashion, narco fashion, or music, and on those bases offer interpretations that are transcendent in their own right, which can reveal new dimensions of human creativity and imagination. The reason for not doing this is straightforward. Upon my first encounter with the social or cultural phenomena of narco culture, with this form of life, I was struck not by its literature or its art forms, nor by its potential to contribute to a cosmopolitan vision of human sociality in the 21st century. Rather, I was shocked by the excessiveness of its violence, by a form of life that demands life as a ritual offering. That is what I encountered when narco culture gave itself to my philosophical interests, was the real destruction of the concrete other as a primary cultural objective, a modus operandi that runs through its center, its peripheries, and its outsides. From a philosophical standpoint, I recognized that the abstract nature of this culture is not what demands attention. Instead, what demands attention is the concreteness of the culture, its real violence and brutality. I mean, I think that summarizes your approach.
Mhm.
I understand it. If you want to say something on that, um, that would be great for our viewers.
Yeah, I mean, it says it all there, right? I mean, it's I think that that I put an epigraph in the beginning of the introduction where I take the headline from the Washington Post.
Yeah,
Even I mean, I found that later. Like I didn't start with that. Like
of course.
but I found it interesting that the Washington Post had the headline that said a real crisis of civilization is taking place south of the border, and that
Hmm.
was it. That was the end of it. Like okay, so
Wow.
nothing much to say here except that. And but to me, that's exactly what it is, right? It's a crisis of civilization that's
Hmm.
taking place down on the other side of the border, and that's being literally fueled by consumerism in the United States. Right?
Right.
I didn't get to talk about that aspect of
Yeah.
narco culture in the book. Although in the original draft I did have that.
Uh-huh.
I had a whole chapter of it, but then when the reviewers came back, they were uh, not they didn't find it useful for the ultimate project that I was
Mhm.
trying to put forth, right? And so
Right.
I took it out. I didn't really struggle against that. Like it's fine.
Yeah.
But uh, there's crisis of civilization that's taking place south of the border that we need to attend to, and and it's a tremendously important crisis. It's a
Hmm.
place where the concrete other is being dehumanized to such an extent that their deaths mean nothing, right?
Hmm.
And they're being just funneled into this very neoliberal economic system, which is the transnational economic trade.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's okay that we don't talk more about it, and
Hmm.
I couldn't stand by and let that go.
Right.
I needed to focus on it more, and I need to think about it. And I think that that's what really motivated me to do it.
Yeah.
At the end of the at the end of the book, I say something about, even though I'm focusing on this particular case study, uh, these kinds of this analysis can transcend and be applied to different areas. And I hope it does, right? I hope
Hmm.
somebody takes the analysis and uses it to talk about different areas where this is happening.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the narco stuff, because the narco
Right.
stuff is important, but the way that brutality and has ingrained itself, or has um,
That's right.
and ensconce itself in particular cultural context, I think that that's important.
Absolutely. So thank you, Carlos, for joining us and for this really insightful and careful conversation where we were trying our best to have a very technical kind of understanding of the text. I really appreciate you for that. I want to let all our viewers know that we are actually organizing a book symposium on Carlos's book, and hopefully in the coming months. We're trying for February, but sometimes those things, especially under COVID situation, it's not easy to get the reviews back. So we plan to have a longer kind of engagement with the text. Thank you again. Thanks for listening. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Carlos.